The world remembers the giants of the Cold War. Names like John F. Kennedy, Nikita Khrushchev, Richard Nixon, Leonid Brezhnev. Superpowers locked in a struggle that could annihilate humanity in the blink of an eye. But in the shadows of this monumental clash, there was another figure. A man whose iron will carved out an independent path for his small, fragile nation. A man who refused to bow to either Washington or Moscow. A man who, against all odds, defied the superpowers. And yet, history has all but erased him. This is the story of Josip Broz Tito, the dictator of Yugoslavia. To his enemies, he was a tyrant who crushed dissent. To his admirers, he was the only leader brave enough to resist both East and West. And to the millions who lived under his rule, he was an enigma. A father figure and a jailer, a visionary and a despot. His name once echoed across the globe, and now it is nearly forgotten. But how does a man rise from the ruins of war-torn Europe to stand toe-to-toe with the superpowers? And why does the world no longer speak his name? To answer that, we need to journey back to the blood-soaked landscapes of World War II. It is 1941. Europe burns. Nazi Germany has unleashed blitzkrieg, sweeping across the continent with terrifying speed. France has fallen. Britain struggles to survive. And in the Balkans, Yugoslavia, a fragile kingdom stitched together after World War I, faces its darkest hour. The Nazis invade, and the country shatters. Ethnic tensions explode. The Croats, Serbs, Bosniaks, Slovenes, and others who made up this uneasy union descend into chaos. But in the mountains, a resistance is born. Not under kings, not under generals, but under a man of steel determination. Josip Broz, who would soon be known simply as Tito. He was no aristocrat, no celebrated soldier. Tito was the son of a peasant family, a metalworker by trade. Before the war, he had been a communist working underground, hunted by monarchist police. But when the Nazis came, he seized his moment. He organized partisans into a guerrilla army, striking from the forests and villages, sabotaging railways, ambushing German convoys. And unlike other resistance movements, Tito's partisans weren't fighting just for liberation, they were fighting for revolution. The Nazis unleashed brutal reprisals. Entire villages burned. Civilians slaughtered by the tens of thousands. But the more they tried to crush him, the stronger Tito became. By the end of the war, he wasn't just a partisan commander, he was a national hero. The liberator of Yugoslavia. But the real test came after the war. The world was no longer divided between Nazis and allies. It was divided between two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. And here, Tito faced his most dangerous gamble. At first, Tito aligned with Joseph Stalin. Both were communists. Both had risen from obscurity to power. Tito rebuilt Yugoslavia in the Soviet model: collectivized farms, centralized economy, political repression. For Stalin, Tito seemed the perfect ally. But Stalin had made a grave mistake. He underestimated Tito's ambition. Tito was not content to be Moscow's puppet. Unlike other communist leaders in Eastern Europe, Tito refused to let Soviet officers command his army. He refused to let Moscow dictate policy. And when Stalin demanded submission, Tito gave him an answer that shook the communist world. No, it was unthinkable. In 1948, Yugoslavia broke with the Soviet Union. Stalin branded Tito a traitor, a renegade, a fascist in disguise. Soviet media declared that Tito would soon be overthrown by his own people. Stalin even sent assassins to kill him. One by one, they failed. Tito, defiant, sent a chilling message back to Moscow. Stop sending assassins. If you don't, I will send one to Moscow, and I will not have to send a second. In that moment, Tito became the only man in the world who dared stand up to Stalin and survive. But survival came at a cost. Yugoslavia was now isolated, cut off from Soviet aid, surrounded by hostile communist neighbors. The world expected Tito's regime to collapse within months. But once again, he defied expectations. Instead of crumbling, Tito looked west. And here lies the paradox of his rule. While he remained a communist dictator, crushing political opposition and maintaining a one-party state, he turned to the United States for help. Washington, eager to exploit this split in the communist bloc, poured aid into Yugoslavia. Food, weapons, money. For the first time, Yugoslavia was not under Moscow's boot, nor fully under Washington's control. Tito had done the impossible. He played the superpowers against each other, keeping his nation alive by balancing on a razor's edge. And yet, this balancing act was not only about survival. Tito dreamed of something greater. He imagined a world where smaller nations would not be swallowed by superpower rivalry. A world where independence could thrive. Out of this vision came what would later be known as the Non-Aligned Movement, a coalition of countries refusing to side with either NATO or the Warsaw Pact. But that, as we will see, came later. For now, in the late 1940s, Tito was both feared and admired. Feared because inside Yugoslavia he ruled with an iron fist. Political opponents vanished into prisons, critics silenced, dissent crushed. Admired because outside Yugoslavia he was a symbol of defiance. He was proof that Stalin was not invincible. Imagine the psychological shock across Eastern Europe. Stalin, the man who had murdered millions, who had cowed entire nations into obedience, had failed to break Tito. For ordinary people living under communist regimes, this was a glimmer of hope. For communist leaders, it was a warning. But Tito's defiance also made him a target. Not just from Moscow, but from within his own fractured country. Because Yugoslavia was not a single nation, it was a federation of nations bound by Tito's iron grip. Croats, Serbs, Bosniaks, Slovenes, Macedonians, Montenegrins. Old rivalries simmered beneath the surface. Tito had united them in war, but peace was far harder to maintain. Still, for now, he held them together. Through charisma, through fear, through relentless control. And so, the man who had risen from the shadows of war now stood at the center of the world stage. A dictator who had humiliated Stalin. A survivor who bent the rules of the Cold War. A forgotten figure today, but in those years, one of the most dangerous men alive. But how long could one man keep the wolves at bay? Could Yugoslavia truly stand independent between East and West? And what would Tito's defiance ultimately cost his people? As the Cold War deepened, Tito's balancing act would drag him into conspiracies, betrayals, and global intrigue. And while the world watched America and the Soviet Union, the fate of a small Balkan nation would quietly shape the course of history. This is just the beginning of the forgotten dictator's story. The year is 1950. The world is frozen in fear. The Iron Curtain has descended across Europe, and the Cold War is no longer just whispers. It is confrontation. The Berlin blockade, the first nuclear arms race, the Korean War. Superpowers now openly test one another's strength, pushing humanity to the brink. And in the middle of this dangerous new world order stood Josip Broz Tito, not as a pawn, not as a mere observer, but as a man who dared to chart his own course. His gamble against Stalin had paid off, at least for now. The Soviet Union had failed to overthrow him, failed to assassinate him, failed to bring Yugoslavia back into its orbit. And the Americans, desperate to exploit any crack in the communist bloc, had embraced him with aid, weapons, and quiet diplomatic protection. But Tito was no fool. He knew the Americans did not love him. They feared him almost as much as the Soviets did. For Washington, Tito was a tool, a temporary ally useful until discarded. For Moscow, he was a traitor. For the rest of the world, he was an enigma. And so, Tito asked himself a question that would define the next chapter of his life. Could there be another path? The answer came to him slowly. Tito looked beyond Europe, beyond the nuclear chessboard of East versus West. He looked to the countries of Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, nations recently freed from colonial empires or still struggling for independence. They did not want to be pawns either. They wanted freedom from both Washington and Moscow. Tito saw an opportunity. He imagined a third way, not communist, not capitalist, independent. It was a bold dream, and in 1950 it sounded almost insane. The world was polarized like never before. Every nation was expected to pick a side. NATO or Warsaw Pact, West or East, blue or red. To remain neutral was to invite suspicion, to court disaster. But Tito had already survived Stalin. He was willing to gamble again. The idea first took shape in secret meetings. Tito reached out to leaders who, like him, refused to bow to either bloc. Among them was Jawaharlal Nehru, the Prime Minister of India, a man who had led his country out of British colonial rule and believed fiercely in independence. Another was Gamal Abdel Nasser, the fiery leader of Egypt, who had seized power with dreams of Arab nationalism and defiance against Western domination. Together, these men began to shape what would become the non-aligned movement. Their vision was simple yet revolutionary. Smaller nations standing together, refusing to be dragged into superpower wars, refusing to let their lands become battlegrounds for foreign interests. But visions are dangerous. And for Tito, it meant one thing: both superpowers would now see him not just as defiant, but as a threat. Inside Yugoslavia, Tito tightened his grip. He knew he could not afford weakness. His state was fragile, an artificial federation of ethnic groups bound together by fear of collapse. Tito became the glue, the unifying force. He promoted the idea of brotherhood and unity, a slogan meant to drown out centuries of blood feuds between Serbs, Croats, Bosniaks, and others. But slogans were not enough. Tito ruled with an iron fist. His secret police, the UDBA, crushed dissent. Prisons filled with anyone accused of disloyalty, from communists loyal to Moscow to nationalists who dreamed of independence. And on a barren island in the Adriatic Sea, Tito built one of the most feared prisons in Europe, Goli Otok, the Bear Island. Here, political prisoners endured brutal conditions, endless re-education, and inhuman punishments. To defy Tito meant not only prison, but humiliation and despair. This was the paradox of Tito. To the outside world, he was a hero of independence, a symbol of defiance against superpowers. But to many inside his own country, he was a dictator who tolerated no opposition. And yet, his people followed him. Because unlike other dictators, Tito gave Yugoslavia something rare: dignity. In a Europe divided between East and West, Yugoslav citizens could travel freely. They could work abroad. They could glimpse both worlds while their neighbors remained trapped behind barbed wire and watchtowers. To many Yugoslavs, Tito was both jailer and liberator. And for now, they tolerated the contradictions. By the mid-1950s, Tito's reputation was no longer just regional, it was global. He was the man who stood up to Stalin and lived. The man who resisted American control. And now, the man who dared to imagine a movement of nations free from both. The culmination came in 1961, when the first official non-aligned movement conference took place in Belgrade, Yugoslavia's capital. Leaders from across the globe arrived. India's Nehru, Egypt's Nasser, Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah, Indonesia's Sukarno. Dozens of newly independent states stood together, declaring to the world that they would not be pawns in a Cold War game. And presiding over this gathering was Tito. The partisan fighter who once hid in the forests now hosted kings and presidents. The peasant's son who once fled police raids now welcomed world leaders under his command. In that moment, Tito was not merely a dictator, he was a global statesman. But if Tito thought he had secured safety for his nation, he was mistaken. Because defying the superpowers meant living under constant threat. The Soviets had never forgiven him. Even after Stalin's death in 1953, tensions with Moscow remained raw. Tito feared that one day Soviet tanks might roll across his borders, just as they had in Hungary in 1956. The Americans, meanwhile, never fully trusted him. Washington smiled when Tito humiliated Moscow, but frowned when he refused to align fully with NATO. They gave him money, but always with suspicion. And as the non-aligned movement grew, both Washington and Moscow realized something dangerous. Tito was not merely surviving between them. He was inspiring others to resist them. In private, both sides plotted. Assassination attempts never fully stopped. Tito lived surrounded by bodyguards, always aware that the next drink of wine, the next handshake, the next friendly smile might conceal a killer. He was not paranoid. He was realistic. Dozens of plots against his life were uncovered. Some backed by Moscow, others by exiled enemies, some by radicals who saw him as a betrayer of true communism. And yet Tito endured. Charismatic, cunning, ruthless when needed, charming when it suited him. His survival became a symbol of Yugoslavia itself, a fragile, improbable nation balancing between collapse and triumph. The 1960s brought Tito to the height of his power. His country prospered more than its Eastern Bloc neighbors. Tourists flooded the Adriatic coast. Western films played in Belgrade cinemas. American jazz echoed in nightclubs while Soviet propaganda was quietly mocked behind closed doors. And yet, beneath the surface, cracks deepened. The ethnic rivalries Tito had suppressed with force still simmered. His promise of brotherhood and unity was more fragile than he admitted. For now, his presence alone held the country together. But what would happen when he was gone? That question haunted Yugoslavia, though few dared to ask it openly. For now, Tito was untouchable. The world saw him as larger than life. The man who defied Stalin, the man who rejected Washington, the man who built a global movement of independence. But history is never simple. Every triumph carries a hidden cost. And Tito's gamble to keep Yugoslavia independent came with consequences that no one could yet see. Because while the world applauded him, inside his own borders, the seeds of future chaos were already being planted. The forgotten dictator had risen from guerrilla fighter to world leader. He had humiliated Stalin, rejected Washington, and inspired nations across the globe. But his greatest challenge was not the superpowers. It was not assassins, spies, or coups. His greatest challenge was time. For a man can defy the world, but no man can defy mortality. And the moment Tito's iron grip loosened, the fragile union he had built would face its reckoning. But that reckoning was still years away. For now, Tito basked in his triumph. A dictator who had become a symbol of freedom. A paradox the world struggled to understand. A name that once echoed louder than any, yet today, is nearly forgotten. The 1960s were an age of upheaval. The Berlin Wall rose. The Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world to the brink of nuclear annihilation. Vietnam burned, Africa erupted in revolutions, and the Middle East trembled with wars and coups. In this era of giants, Kennedy, Khrushchev, Mao, Castro, one unlikely figure walked among them as an equal: Josip Broz Tito. By now, he was no longer just the dictator of a small Balkan federation. He had transformed himself into something extraordinary. A global statesman, the leader of the non-aligned movement, the one man who had stood up to both superpowers and survived. And with this reputation came influence. His name opened doors across the world. Presidents, kings, and revolutionaries all courted his attention. For in the Cold War, where every nation was forced to pick a side, Tito represented something unique: independence. In 1963, Tito's Yugoslavia became a stage for world diplomacy. Belgrade was no longer just a city, it was a symbol. Leaders from Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East walked its boulevards. They came to pledge that they, too, would not be pawns in the Cold War. When Tito traveled abroad, he was received with honors usually reserved for superpower leaders. In India, he was welcomed by Prime Minister Nehru like a brother. In Egypt, President Nasser paraded him through Cairo's streets as a hero of anti-imperialism. In Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah saw him as proof that small nations could defy the giants. And then came his most audacious journeys, visits to both Washington and Moscow, where he sat face-to-face with the very leaders he refused to obey. In 1963, Tito met John F. Kennedy in the White House. It was a surreal moment. A man who had once been hunted in the forests of Yugoslavia now shook hands with the leader of the free world. Kennedy, still reeling from the Cuban Missile Crisis, wanted to pull Tito closer to the West. But Tito was not easily charmed. He sat with the young American president as an equal, listening politely, speaking firmly, never offering submission. Kennedy recognized the paradox. Tito was a communist dictator, yet also a valuable check against Soviet power. He could not be ignored. And so, the United States smiled, extended trade agreements, and sent more aid, while always watching him carefully, always wondering, was Tito truly independent, or simply playing a longer game? After Kennedy's assassination, Tito would meet Lyndon B. Johnson, Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, and Jimmy Carter. Each encounter was the same. American leaders, cautious and curious, trying to woo him without ever truly trusting him. But Tito's defiance was not only directed at the West. He also visited Moscow again and again. After Stalin's death in 1953, Nikita Khrushchev tried to repair the broken bond. He traveled to Belgrade in 1955, the first Soviet leader ever to visit a foreign communist country. For Moscow, it was humiliating. The student begging forgiveness from the rebel teacher. Tito welcomed Khrushchev warmly, smiling for the cameras, but privately, he made it clear Yugoslavia would never again be ruled from Moscow. This dance with the superpowers became Tito's art form. He accepted aid from Washington, but never became an American puppet. He restored relations with Moscow, but never allowed Soviet troops on Yugoslav soil. He walked a tightrope so narrow, so dangerous, that one misstep could have destroyed his nation. And yet, he never fell. For Yugoslavia, these years were golden. While Eastern Europe groaned under the weight of Soviet command economies, Yugoslavia opened itself to the world. Its citizens enjoyed a standard of living higher than that of their neighbors in Poland, Hungary, or Romania. Tourists from the West flocked to its Adriatic beaches, sipping wine and basking under the same sun as locals. The Yugoslav passport became a symbol of privilege. Its holders could travel freely to both East and West. While Soviet citizens could not dream of visiting Paris or Rome, a Yugoslav worker could take a job in West Germany, then return home with money in his pocket and stories of the outside world. To many, it seemed Tito had achieved the impossible. A communist state with Western freedoms, an Eastern nation with Western luxuries. But it was not magic. It was strategy. Tito borrowed heavily from the West, using loans and trade to fuel prosperity. He relied on American aid to fill the gaps, while still maintaining the communist command structure at home. It worked brilliantly for a time. As Tito's fame grew, so did his legend. He became a master of spectacle. Foreign leaders were dazzled by his lavish receptions on the Berjuni Islands, his summer residence on the Adriatic. He entertained them with yachts, orchestras, and endless feasts, projecting the image of a leader both powerful and refined. He cultivated friendships with the great revolutionaries of the era. Fidel Castro, leader of Cuba, saw Tito as an elder brother in defiance. Yet even here, Tito's independence shone through. While Castro fully embraced Moscow, Tito warned him not to become another pawn. Their friendship was real, but Tito never surrendered his judgment to Havana or to anyone else. Perhaps his most audacious gesture came during the 1970s, when he visited China and shook hands with Mao Zedong. It was a symbolic moment. The rebel who had defied Stalin now embracing the other communist giant who had broken from Moscow. Together, Tito and Mao stood as proof that the communist world was not monolithic, that even within red flags and revolutionary slogans, independence could thrive. But with glory came shadows. Inside Yugoslavia, the contradictions deepened. Tito's rule brought prosperity, but it also brought repression. The UDBA secret police still hunted dissidents, still silenced critics. Nationalist movements, whether Croatian, Serbian, or Albanian, were crushed before they could gain momentum. Tito could not allow the delicate balance of his multi-ethnic state to crack. His solution was simple. He made himself indispensable. He became the father of the nation, the one figure who could rise above ethnic rivalries and speak of unity. He was everywhere, on posters, on television, in schools. Children sang songs about him. Workers praised him. Foreign journalists marveled at his charisma. But what no one dared to say aloud was that Yugoslavia's unity was not born of true harmony. It was born of Tito himself. And Tito, despite his legend, was mortal. As the Cold War shifted into the 1970s, Tito grew older. His hair turned white, his steps slower, but his authority never wavered. At international summits, he was still treated with reverence. When he spoke, leaders listened. And yet, beneath the grandeur, a quiet unease spread across Yugoslavia. Economic cracks began to show. Foreign loans piled up. Inflation stirred. And in the shadows, nationalist whispers grew louder. Croats demanded more autonomy. Albanians in Kosovo protested. Serbs grumbled that they were carrying too much of the burden. For now, Tito silenced them all. But the question could no longer be ignored. What would happen when he was gone? In the late 1970s, Tito made one last world tour. He visited Havana, Cairo, Delhi, and countless capitals, still proclaiming the strength of the non-aligned movement. He was cheered as a symbol of independence, a man who had defied the giants and carved his own destiny. But time was catching him. He had ruled Yugoslavia for over 3 decades, longer than most kings, presidents, or emperors of his age. And though he remained sharp, his body was failing. Still, the legend of Tito endured. To many across the globe, he remained the forgotten giant of the Cold War, the man who had outlived Stalin, outmaneuvered Washington, outlasted Khrushchev, and still commanded respect on the world stage. But history is cruel. For while Tito lived, Yugoslavia stood. And once he was gone, the unity he had forged through charisma and control would unravel into fire and blood. That reckoning was still on the horizon. For now, in the twilight of his reign, Tito remained untouchable. The peasant's son who became a partisan, the partisan who became a dictator, the dictator who became a global statesman. A man who walked among giants and defied them all. The 1970s marked the twilight of Tito's reign. Yet even in his old age, he was a man larger than life. His white hair perfectly combed. His uniforms decorated with medals from battles long past. His voice, still steady, still commanding. For Yugoslavia, these years were a paradox. On the surface, the country seemed stable, even prosperous. Tourists flooded the Dalmatian coast, sipping wine by the Adriatic, while workers returned from Germany and Austria with money in their pockets. Western films played in Belgrade's theaters, Soviet books filled the libraries, and jazz spilled out of smoky bars at night. In the Cold War world of rigid borders and iron curtains, Yugoslavia looked like a miracle. But beneath the glitter, cracks were forming. Cracks that no one dared to confront openly, because to question Yugoslavia was to question Tito himself. And Tito still ruled with the same iron grip he had forged decades earlier in the forests of war. Tito's cult of personality reached its peak during this time. His face was everywhere, on stamps, in classrooms, on murals in city squares. Children sang songs praising Comrade Tito, taught from an early age that he was not just a leader, but the father of the nation. Each May, Yugoslavia celebrated Tito's birthday with a spectacle known as the Relay of Youth. A baton would be carried by thousands of young people across the Federation, through villages and cities, across mountains and rivers, until it reached Belgrade. There, in front of tens of thousands, the baton would be presented to Tito himself. It was more than a birthday gift. It was a ritual of loyalty, a ritual of unity, and yet it was also a ritual of fear. Everyone knew that Tito was the glue holding the Federation together. Without him, old rivalries, Serb against Croat, Croat against Bosniak, Albanian against Serb, might erupt again. But no one dared speak the truth aloud. Instead, they cheered, they waved flags, they shouted slogans of brotherhood and unity, because Tito was not just their leader, he was their shield. Internationally, Tito remained a respected figure. World leaders still traveled to Belgrade to seek his advice, to court his support, to admire his independence. He was a regular guest in Cairo, Havana, New Delhi, and countless other capitals of the developing world. The non-aligned movement, his creation, had grown into a powerful coalition, representing over half the globe's population. And when he appeared at its summits, walking slowly now, but still with dignity, he was treated with reverence. For these nations, Tito was proof that defiance was possible, that the world did not have to bend to Washington or Moscow. But Tito's health was fading. He was a man in his 80s, plagued by diabetes and heart problems. His doctors begged him to slow down, but Tito refused. He knew his image was his greatest weapon. If the world saw him weaken, if Yugoslavia sensed weakness, the illusion of eternal unity might shatter. So he kept moving, kept traveling, kept appearing at parades, summits, and ceremonies, even as his body betrayed him. But inside the Federation, storms gathered. The 1970s saw economic troubles deepen. The prosperity of earlier years had been fueled by loans from the West. Now debts piled high. Inflation crept into daily life. Workers went on strike. Discontent grew not just about economics but about identity. In Croatia, nationalist voices demanded more autonomy. In Kosovo, the Albanian majority protested for rights, clashing with Serbian authorities. In Slovenia, whispers of independence began to surface. Tito responded the only way he knew how, with repression. Protests were crushed. Dissidents were jailed. The UDBA grew more ruthless than ever, watching every movement, silencing every voice that dared speak of separation. Still, Tito was not blind. He knew the fractures were real. In 1974, he oversaw a new constitution, an attempt to balance the competing nationalities of Yugoslavia. It granted more autonomy to the republics Croatia, Slovenia, Bosnia, Serbia, Macedonia, Montenegro, and to the provinces of Kosovo and Vojvodina. On paper, it was a masterstroke. Every group had a voice, every region a measure of self-rule. But in practice, it planted the seeds of disintegration. For once Tito was gone, who would hold the federation together? Who would stop each republic from pulling in its own direction? By the late 1970s, Tito's image as a world leader had reached almost mythical proportions. When Queen Elizabeth II visited Yugoslavia in 1972, Tito hosted her with pomp and ceremony that rivaled London itself. When Richard Nixon arrived in 1970, crowds filled the streets, cheering not just for the American president but for the man who had kept his country independent. On the Berjuni Islands, Tito's luxurious retreat, he entertained world leaders with style. His private residence was filled with exotic animals, gifts from foreign leaders, lions from Africa, parrots from South America, elephants from Asia. His parties became legendary, blending politics with opulence. For ordinary Yugoslavs, this lifestyle was a distant dream. But for the outside world, it reinforced Tito's image as not just a leader, but a king without a crown. And yet, time was relentless. In 1979, Tito's health worsened dramatically. He was hospitalized, his mobility restricted, his strength fading. Doctors fought to keep him alive, but the dictator who had defied Stalin, outmaneuvered Washington, and united a fractured land could not defy age. On May 4, 1980, the inevitable happened. Josip Broz Tito was dead. The news spread like a shockwave across Yugoslavia. Factories stopped. Schools emptied. Streets filled with weeping citizens. The man they had feared, adored, and depended on was gone. And then came the funeral. It was one of the largest gatherings of world leaders in history. Kings, presidents, and prime ministers descended on Belgrade. From east and west alike, they came. Leonid Brezhnev of the Soviet Union, Margaret Thatcher of Britain, the Shah of Iran, Indira Gandhi of India, and dozens more. Even bitter enemies stood side by side to honor him. For one day, the Cold War paused, as the world bowed before the forgotten dictator. The sheer scale of the funeral spoke to Tito's unique place in history. He had been more than a Balkan leader. He had been a global figure, respected by allies and rivals alike. But as his coffin was lowered, a darker truth settled over Yugoslavia. Tito had been the glue holding the nation together. Without him, what remained? In the days after his death, Yugoslavia declared unity. Leaders promised to follow his vision of brotherhood and unity. His portraits remained on walls, his slogans repeated in speeches. But beneath the solemn ceremonies, fear whispered in every corner. The republics eyed one another with suspicion. Serbia demanded greater authority. Croatia dreamed of independence. Kosovo simmered with unrest. The carefully balanced system Tito had created wobbled dangerously. Everyone knew the truth but dared not say it. Tito had not solved Yugoslavia's divisions. He had only contained them. Now the container was gone. And though few could see it yet, the Balkan storm was already forming. A storm that would, within a decade, tear Yugoslavia apart in one of the bloodiest conflicts Europe had seen since World War II. But that is the tragedy of Tito's legacy. For while he lived, he was a giant. The dictator who defied the superpowers. The peasant's son who ruled kings and presidents. The forgotten man who once bent history with his will. And yet, in death, He left behind a nation destined to unravel. For Yugoslavia, the age of Tito was over. The age of chaos was about to begin. The dictator sat in his gilded office, the once proud walls of his palace echoing with an emptiness he could not ignore. The chandeliers still sparkled above him. The red carpet still whispered of power. But outside the gates, his people murmured of hunger, betrayal, and despair. For decades, he had defied the great powers of the world, America and the Soviet Union, laughing in the face of their threats, bargaining with their leaders, manipulating their weaknesses. Yet now, the world was changing faster than he could control, and his name, once spoken with fear and respect, was beginning to carry a new weight, irrelevance. He had always believed history would remember him as the man who outsmarted the giants. But history, as he was about to discover, can be merciless. The Cold War was no longer the rigid chess game he had mastered. When he first rose to power, it was easy to play Washington against Moscow, extracting weapons from one side, financial aid from the other, all while declaring his nation proudly independent. But by the late 1980s, the Soviet Union was crumbling. Reformers like Mikhail Gorbachev spoke of glasnost and perestroika, of a world where confrontation would give way to cooperation. For the dictator, this was a nightmare. Without the constant tension between the superpowers, his role as the clever middleman was vanishing. The Americans no longer needed him to block Soviet influence, and the Soviets no longer had the resources to fund his dreams of greatness. His threats carried less weight. His speeches sounded increasingly hollow. And so, cornered, he turned to the only strategy he knew: double down on defiance. He began to build himself into something more than a man. Statues of his image towered in every city square. His portrait watched from every school, every government office, every home where loyalty was demanded. He crafted myths of his childhood, tales of heroic struggles against colonial powers, stories of visions and destiny. His propaganda machine rewrote history to cast him as the eternal liberator, the only man who had the courage to stand up to both the eagle and the bear. Crowds were forced into parades chanting his name. Children recited hymns in his honor. He was no longer just a president, a general, or a leader. He was the nation itself. And yet, even as the applause thundered, a dangerous silence lurked behind it. People were starving. His refusal to bow to superpowers had cost his country dearly. Sanctions strangled the economy. Imports vanished. Bread lines stretched through city streets. Black markets thrived where the government failed. But to admit weakness would be to admit defeat, and so he doubled down yet again. It wasn't his policies, he declared, but a global conspiracy against him. As the Cold War ended, his grip grew more desperate. Once, the CIA and the KGB had both tried to assassinate him, sometimes simultaneously, but he had survived with cunning and brutality. Now, the threats came not from Washington or Moscow, but from his own ministers, his own generals, his own family. Whispers of coups spread like wildfire. Some believed he was too dangerous to keep, others that he was too weak to lead. His inner circle, once bound together by loyalty and fear, fractured into factions. He responded the only way he knew how: purges. Generals vanished overnight. Ministers fled into exile. His own blood relatives were imprisoned, accused of plotting against him. Fear became absolute, but so did isolation. He had eliminated every rival, but in doing so, he had also eliminated trust. He was, for the first time in decades, truly alone. But dictators do not fade quietly. And so he plotted one final gamble, one last attempt to carve his name into the stone of history. If the superpowers no longer cared, he would force them to. He spoke of new alliances, of secret weapons, of a movement that would once again set his small nation at the center of the world. Some say he reached out to rogue states, offering support in exchange for funds. Others claim he financed terrorist groups, hoping to destabilize the balance of power. Still others believe he gambled on nuclear ambition, whispering of scientists working in hidden labs deep underground. The truth remains buried in archives, classified documents, and the testimony of survivors who dare not speak. But whatever his plan was, it failed. His enemies were no longer cautious superpowers unwilling to trigger global war. They were his own starving people, his broken military, and a world that had simply moved on. The end came not with an invasion, not with a CIA coup, not with Soviet tanks, but with the slow collapse of his own system. Riots broke out in the capital. Soldiers refused to fire on crowds. The chants of his name turned into curses. His once mighty army melted away, either deserting or turning against him. Inside the palace, he raged against betrayal, still convinced he could turn the tide. But outside, the tide had already swallowed him whole. The people who had once feared him now marched through his streets, tearing down his statues, burning his portraits, and shouting for justice. Some dictators flee in private jets. Some cling to power until the last bullet. His end was somewhere in between. Captured by those who had once served him, he was paraded before the cameras. The man who had once stood defiant before American presidents and Soviet premiers now appeared disheveled, frail, and beaten. His trial was a spectacle, not of justice, but of vengeance. His crimes were read aloud. Executions, tortures, economic ruin, endless wars. He denied everything, still insisting he was a victim of imperialist plots. But no one was listening. The verdict was already written before the trial began. When the sentence was carried out, the world barely noticed. The superpowers he had spent his life defying did not mourn his fall, nor did they celebrate it. For Washington and Moscow, he was already irrelevant. For his people, he was a monster finally dethroned. And yet, something strange happened in the years that followed. His image, once despised, began to creep back into memory. For some, he became a symbol of resistance, a man who had stood unbending against the giants of the age. For others, he remained a tyrant, a destroyer who brought nothing but misery. His legacy was fractured, contested, rewritten again and again. But one fact remained undeniable. For a time, this forgotten dictator had forced the world to notice him. Today, few remember his name outside of history books and documentaries. His nation, rebuilt in the ashes of his rule, often avoids mentioning him at all. But hidden in archives, buried in testimonies, and whispered in forgotten villages, his story lingers. Because his story is not just about one man, it is about power itself. About how a single leader can bend nations, challenge empires, and yet, in the end, be destroyed not by external enemies, but by the weight of his own lies. The forgotten dictator believed he could defy history. He believed he could outplay the greatest powers of his time. For decades, he succeeded. But history, like the tide, cannot be resisted forever. And so his statues were toppled, his portraits burned, his palaces looted. His people, once terrified into silence, spoke freely again. He had defied the superpowers. But in the end, he could not defy the truth.